So it's time to begin our proceedings. And I'm Victoria Harrison, the head of the Philosophy and Religious Studies department here. So it's my very happy job to welcome you all to this event today. It's great to have people coming out here to our University of Macau campus, and especially as this is the first collaborative event of several. The philosophy department and the Macau Ricci Institute. So we're really grateful for all of you who've come here to support this event. And I hope that you enjoy it as much as I will. And I look forward to talking with some of you over our pastries during the reception afterwards. So that's all from me. And I will now hand over to our co-organizer from the Ricci Institute, who will be introducing himself.
Thank you very much, Professor Victoria Harrison. It's a great honor and privilege to start this collaboration between the University of Macau, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and the Macau Ricci Institute at the University of St. Joseph. Also, the origin is actually quite tragic because, as some of you remember, 6 years ago, the Ricci Institute lost the entire collection. 25,000 books were flooding in the aftermath of Typhoon Hato. We lost everything, and was really a traumatic loss of the memory of Macau. So I was very touched that some of you who are here took the initiative to help us to rescue some books. And of course, we understood they would not give it back to the Ricci Institute, but have a section in the library of the University of Macau devoted to Matteo Ricci. We have now the exhibition on Matteo Ricci from September last year until March 19th. And for us, it's a welcome opportunity to forge ahead with a dialogue between East and West, as initiated by Matteo Ricci. I'm so glad that we have the chance that Professor Thierry Meynard, Mei-Chien Li, is among us, who is a specialist on this topic. His last article at the Matteo Ricci Institute Journal described Matteo Ricci as a wonderful positive encounter between East and West. And so we want to explore also this presence of God, how he provocatively put it, the Chinese Christ in the people of China. I think that's also, so to speak, your life mission. We also think the context is a huge project. My predecessor could not hear the name anymore. Is Acta Pekinensia, is about this conflict of the rights controversy. So we have published 2 volumes, and the 3rd volume should be published this year. So in this context of also this traumatic experience of a century controversy, we will look at Matteo Ricci. So over to you. I think you all know Father Thierry Meynard, who has a PhD of Peking University, Liangshu Ning, and since 2006, he's ordinary professor of philosophy at the University of Sun Yat-sen in Guangzhou. So thank you, Professor Meynard, very much for coming, joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Father Rofflin, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and especially in this so beautiful library of UMac. And so I'm very pleased to see Professor Wu Jianzhong also with us, has been doing such a tremendous work in that library. And I also acknowledge also Professor Harrison, I mean, the head of the department. I mean, I've been many times to the Department of Philosophy at UMAC, and many good colleagues and collaboration in the past few years. And I'm very happy also that Novia Dolcini has accepted to be the respondent, especially because Professor Dolcini, in fact, has been educated at Macerata. And so the place, the birthplace of Matteo Ricci. So I think we have a strong Ricci connection between Macerata and Macau, and which was the first place where Matteo Ricci started to understand the Chinese culture before moving to Chongqing and elsewhere. So so today my talk is about, of course, Matteo Ricci and the Chinese Rites Controversy. So the Chinese Rites Controversy constitute a watershed in the history of the Catholic mission in China. And so I'm going first to discuss how Father Matteo Ricci has developed his understanding on the Chinese rites. But that happened, his understanding, long before the controversy. At the time of Ricci, there was a discussion, but not really a controversy. And we see how Ricci decided for a kind of a generous interpretation about the nature of the rites. And we shall analyze how this interpretation, in fact, evolved along the time. But finally, after his death, his interpretation was rejected by some missionaries, and at the end also by the Vatican. And so at the end of this talk, that which mostly historical, I hope also to tackle a theological issue with you and to discuss from the point of view of theology how to evaluate these Chinese rites today and what is the theological meaning of the rites. And I'm happy to see that we have a few theologians among us, so they can help us into that task. So I will first start to say that until today, the Chinese society is highly ritualized at all levels. And of course, traditionally, the rituals toward the ancestor and the spirit were practiced by all. Everyone were practicing those rituals. And a few of them, I mean, the literati, were performing the ritual toward Confucius. These rituals have maintained the generational continuity of the families and of the countries along the ages. And so Ricci gradually understood the importance of this ritual. And as we are going to see, he allowed the Chinese Christian to continue practicing these rituals. However, after his death, the dispute arose among the missionaries and ended 100 years after the death of Ricci with the condemnation of the rites by the Vatican. So I'm going first to present Ricci's analysis of the rites. So in 1583, so 1 year after coming in Macau, Ricci noticed that the Chinese people have very little divine worship, and that the priests are not highly esteemed. So it is the absence of religion in China that strikes Ricci upon his arrival. But later, he discovered the importance of ritual to Confucius and to the ancestor. So here, I would like to explain the kind of hermeneutical principle of Ricci. And it's a principle that, in fact, is going to express at the end of his life. And when at the end of his life in Beijing, he's going to write the history of the mission. And so what he's going to write? And so that this book is a book in Italian and called De la Entrata, about the entry of the Society of Jesus and Christianity into China. And this book has been translated recently directly from the Italian into Chinese. And because in the past, we were using a translation mostly done from a Trigo and from the Latin version. But that is the translation recently done by Wen Zheng and Professor Menegan is directly from the Italian into the Chinese. But here I'm translating into English, and what Ricci says about his principle, I should say a kind of hermeneutical principle. It was very profitable to draw towards our opinion Confucius, the head of the sect of the literati, by interpreting in our favor something he had left ambiguous in his writings. Through this, ours, I mean the Jesuit, gained great favor with the literati, who do not worship idols. So Ricci acknowledged here the central role of Confucius, of Confucianism in Chinese culture and society. Christianity can only establish itself in China if it becomes Confucianized. But for Ricci, it is not just about conforming to an obligation imposed from outside. Ricci undergoes an intellectual conversion that makes him discover the profound moral value of Confucianism. And an essential expression of Confucianism is the observance of rituals. And Ricci is going to apply his hermeneutical method to the ritual towards ancestor and Confucius. So Ricci inherits from scholasticism the interpretation of superstition as originating from ancestor worship. And so we have that in the Summa Theologica. And in the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven, the Tianzhu, Ricci make echo to this. And he say, so that is the work of Tianzhu. In ancient times, people were simple and honest. And because they did not know the Lord of Heaven, they set up images of those who more or less represented moral authority, or of the departed relatives from whom they felt great affection. And after their death statue, they built ancestor temples in which they placed commemorative tablets. Long afterwards, people went to these temples to burn incense and offer paper money to obtain their protection. So Ricci here is quite cautious. He suggests that ancestor worship was originally entirely legitimate as a kind of manifestation of affection, of feelings of affection toward the ancestor. However, this degenerated into superstition and idolatry with incense and paper money offered to ancestors in exchange for their protection. In the same work, Ricci seems to legitimize ancestor worship in ancient China. And it seems that it goes beyond a manifestation of affection. So here is a passage. Pan Gung was the descendant in the 9th generation of Chengtang, and the nearly 400 years separated them. Yet Pan Gung continued to offer sacrifices to Chengtang and feared him because he believed that Chengtang could send down punishment and misfortune as a warning and encouragement to the people. Obviously, Pan Gung believed that Chengtang continued to live and had not completely disappeared. Similarly, Zui, Pan Gung's successor, claimed that the ancient kings of the Shang dynasty continued to help their descendants, and thus the souls of the dead remained forever indestructible. So this paragraph here, in fact, is related in the book to a section in which Ricci intends to demonstrate that the Chinese people in antiquity believed in the survival of the soul after death. So, in fact, what wants Ricci to mention, he mentioned ancestor worship, not to approve the worship itself, but only to prove the belief in the immortality of the soul among the ancient Chinese. So it is somewhat difficult to judge from the classical text alone the real intention of the ancient kings, and like Cheng Tang or Pangung, in offering sacrifices to their ancestors. And it is easier for Ricci to evaluate the ritual toward Confucius because he could witness this ritual firsthand. He could inquire with the literati. And in History of the Mission that he writes at the end of his life, Ricci is going to mention a few times that he goes to visit that the hall of Confucius, and he's going to describe, in fact, the rituals in those hall of Confucius. So here one of the description. So that it is in the journal, as we say, or that the History of the Mission. So he said that the literati offer incense and the dead animal in sacrifice to him. But they do not recognize him as a deity, and they do not ask him for anything. So it is not a true sacrifice. So when Ricci asserts that the literati do not recognize Confucius as a deity and do not expect anything from him, he applies the hermeneutical principle that I mentioned at the beginning, approving a ritual likely devoid of religious significance for most literati. And so it's kind of a very generous interpretation. But this judgment cannot claim to represent the fault of all the literati at all times and in all regions. The major difficulty lies in the fact that the question of the belief in the retribution of the offerings, this question was not raised in China. What mattered was to participate to the rituals. Everyone could freely attribute a different meaning to the ritual. The emphasis was therefore on orthopraxy and not on orthodoxy, whereas in Catholicism, both are important, and to do the ritual, but also to give them the precise orthodox meaning. For ancestor rituals, the diversity of belief is even greater because in the family rituals, unlike that of Confucius, those rituals are regulated very weakly by the elite. And so the regulation is very weak. So after more than 20 years in China, Ricci admits a significant change in his missionary strategy. And we can find this shift in a letter dated 1605, December 12. It's a letter addressed to his brother, Antonio Maria Ricci. And it's interesting because the content of this letter is only available today in Chinese language. And it was published in that book in 2018 by Wen Zheng, and the same who published the De la Entrata and in Chinese, and he published with Eugenio Menegan the letters of Matteo Ricci. And we have the letter of 1605 of December 12. But this letter, in fact, was discovered by Pasquale Delia, very early. But Pasquale Delia, this Italian Jesuit, did not have the opportunity to publish that letter. So this letter was not published by Delia. And even when we look at the Code Libet edition, published in Macerata in 2001, there is not this letter. And so this letter was published for the first time not in Italian, but in Chinese in this book, I mean, in this collection. And so I know that Professor Meynard is working now on to publish those letters which have never been published. And so I'm thankful to Professor Eugenio Meynard because he provided me the Italian text of that letter. And so of course, we have the Chinese texts which have been published, but not yet the Italian. So in this letter, Ricci say that in the early years, he considered useless to use Chinese rituals. And because of that, because he did not use the Chinese rituals, he got very few results in the mission. But now that he has starting using rituals that do not violate the Christian doctrine and his identity of missionary, he see a very good result. So that it is the content of his letter to his brother in 1605. So through this, Matteo Ricci has gained respect. And he said that the Chinese literati, not only they do not avoid him anymore as before, but they do not want to leave his residence. So they're staying, they want to talk to him longer at his residence, so at Shenhumen, what we call now Nantang, the sub-church. So this letter is an important witness to Ricci's pragmatic approach, who has a better understanding at the end of his life about the Chinese rituals, and now he dares to use them. Not only he accepts that the Chinese Christian practice rituals toward the ancestor, but perhaps Ricci himself participates to some of these rituals, probably not in the church, but perhaps in the ancestral hall. On February 15, 1609, there is another letter that we already quite well known, written to Francesco Passio. And so that is a letter written 1 year before the death of Ricci. So Francesco Passio at that time was the visitor for Japan and China. So he was in charge of all the mission in the East. And Matteo Ricci summarized his missionary experience. And in this letter, he discussed 8 points for the future of the mission. So here I want to say the number 7. He mentioned that thanks to the publication of books and participation to their rituals, so in Italian is cortesie, so the rituals, the Jesuits have obtained the reputation of learned and virtuous men. So this official correspondence of Ricci in 1609 confirmed what he said privately to his brother in 1605. And so we see the evolution here. So in summary, Ricci gradually and cautiously developed an attitude of openness and acceptance of Chinese rituals. His initial motivation was tactical, as the only way to introduce Christianity into Chinese society. But he also demonstrates creativity, flexibility to find a possible conciliation. And here I'm quoting Paul Roule. Paul Roule is a sinologist in Australia, and he said, Ricci recognized that many aspects of Confucianism were ambiguous, that they could be and were interpreted in various ways, some perfectly compatible with basic Christian doctrines, others less so. So the Jesuits should seek to identify their teaching with Confucianism, interpreting in our favor anything which he left ambiguous in his writings. So Ricci therefore makes a bet on a possible interpretation. he also does not provide to the Chinese rite a theological interpretation. However, later, facing difficulties, it would be difficult for the missionaries to settle on this kind of unstable position of Ricci. And so I'm going to move now to the second part to talk about an important player, who is an Italian, Niccolo Longobardo. But you know, Niccolo Longobardo is not from Macerata, from Marche. He's from the south. He's from Caterino in Sicilia. So it's very important because he succeeded to Matteo Ricci as the head of the mission. So the mission inaugurated by Ricci remained very close to the major urban center, so Beijing, Nanjing, Hangzhou, and was closely linked to the literati, and thus developing a kind of generous hermeneutic interpretation toward the Chinese rite. Later, the mission expanded into different areas of China, especially among the countryside, among the I should say, the low classes of the Chinese society, the people who do not follow the rationalist or psychological interpretation of the literati. And so they experience the rituals toward ancestors mostly as a communication and exchange with the dead, in a way quite similar to the popular religion. And so that is completely a different understanding of the Chinese rite. So shortly after Ricci's death, the dispute among the Jesuits focused on the terms to express the concept of God, angels, and human soul in the Chinese language. And so we call that the term controversy. So sometimes we have to distinguish between two controversies. One is called the right controversy, one is a term controversy. So the term controversy, in fact, happened before, because it was raised by Longobardo, and even before, in fact, a Jesuit in Japan, they raised the question about the term. So the term was the three terms: Shandi as an equivalent or not of God, Gueshen as an equivalent of angels, and Lingrun as an equivalent of the soul. Around 1619, Sabatino de Ursis and João Rodrigues wrote a treatise opposing those terms, the use of those terms in the Catholic Church. They consider the terms defective and fostering erroneous conception of divine transcendence. So we have lost the treatise by João Rodrigues and Sabatino de Ursis, but we have a very systematic and detailed treatise written by Niccolo Longobardo. So it's a very famous treatise, which was written after the Jihading. It existed, in fact, during the Jihading conference, but it was expanded until 1629 by Longobardo. And Longobardo discussed mostly the issue of the terms, the term controversy. He conducts a very meticulous analysis of the Confucian philosopher of the Song and Ming dynasty to show that those philosophers, in fact, are atheistic, materialistic. So in his analysis, Longobardo does not delve too much about rituals, but still he has some passages where he's going to mention the rituals. And here I'm going to quote a passage where he mentioned the rituals. So here, in fact, what he's doing is translating a passage of Jushi. So Jushi, the famous Song dynasty philosopher, is a passage where Jushi explains how the ancestor rite is possible. So that is the interpretation of Jushi according to the translation of Longobardo. If there were no spirits, the ancients would not have made a request to them. Moreover, as we know, the ancients abstained from marital relation for 7 days and fasted for 3 more days to prepare themselves to make their request to visible and invisible beings. All this show that the ancients were convinced of the existence of spirit. And so that is quite along the line of what Matteo Ricci could have said. Furthermore, the emperor sacrifices to heaven and earth, so it is certain that there is a heaven and earth. Now, when in the temple of ancestor, one see something remarkable or something a bit special, to say. In fact, it is only the air of the mountains, the chi of the mountain, and the water gathered in that place. After some time, if these temples are abandoned and demolished, there is nothing special, nothing remarkable, because the air and the chi that was in these places is no longer there. So for Jushi, indeed, there is a correspondence between the chi of the person and the chi of the ancestor. And so because there is this kind of relation between my chi and the chi of the ancestor, so there is a possibility of communication during the sacrifice in that particular place, which is the ancestor temple or hall. And so that the chi can gather, can regroup more quickly. So Longobardo concludes this passage as saying, and that again derived from Jushi, spirits are nothing but the agency of the air. And it is to this agency that the sacrifices are made to heaven, earth, mountain, river, a bridge, the kitchen, and ancestral temples. So, agency, of course, here it is an Aristotelian concept about the efficient cause. And what is the efficient cause of everything? In fact, here it should be not a God, but in fact is a chi. Is a chi. So, like Ricci, Longobardo understands the chi of the air as a material element. However, Ricci presumably did not know Jushi's interpretation, but Ricci did not condemn the ritual toward ancestor or Confucius. Ricci had only asserted that when the literati performed the ritual, they did not ask anything in return. This means that for Ricci, the ritual is not superstitious because they don't ask for anything. So it's not superstition. But here, in fact, by providing Jushi's interpretation, Longobardo wants to show, above all, that the literati expect nothing in return because, in fact, they are materialist, they are atheistic. So they make the ritual, but it is a pretense of religion because, in fact, they do not believe at all in the efficiency of those rituals because they think everything is made of a material element of chi. So Ricci had suspected the literati he was in connection with. Ricci suspected them of having some atheistic tendencies. But Longobardo goes much further because Longobardo asserts that even the ancient Chinese, including Confucius, were all atheists, were all materialists. So, moreover, Longobardo introduces a Machiavellian element, Machiavelli. In fact, the literati are actually hiding their atheism. They use religion but as a kind of pretense, using religion to control the society. They perform the rituals that appear religious, but they do not believe in them, because they use religion and its rituals as a means for political control over the people. Thus, for Longobardo, Chinese rituals become even more outrageous because the literati divert religion from its true meaning of expressing transcendence, and they divert this, they empty religion of all transcendence and make it a tool for political purposes. So, of course, in the 16th century and 17th century, there was many discussion in Europe and in Italy and all Europe about this, how to understand the politics and Machiavelli and the role of religion and the state. So that it is very much in the background. So Longobardo already had a well-formed opinion about the atheism of the literati when he undertakes to question a dozen of them. So Longobardo is going to make interviews of literati. And here I would like to mention Benoît Vermander. He makes, in reference to the Chinese Christian, he says, the subtlety of the subtleties of the position of the Chinese Christian do not appear to Longobardo, who strongly suspect them of disguised materialism and a tendency to place all religious teaching, Christianity, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and even Islam, on the same level. So what escaped Longobardo is a process of forming a Christian and a Neo-Confucian orthodoxy simultaneously. And so that it was, Longobardo somehow misses out this, the process of forming this kind of discourse. So Longobardo's criticism mostly focused on the term, but already implied a strong criticism of the ritual toward Confucius and ancestors. So we do not know whether Longobardo himself allowed the Chinese Christian to perform those rituals or not. But in any case, at that time, there was no ritual controversy, and the right controversy happened later. And so now I'd like to move to the third and last part of my talk, is about the condemnation of the rite as superstitious by the church. So when the Franciscan and the Dominican arrived in the Fujian province in the 1630s, they mainly conducted their mission in the rural area. And they were not really in contact with the literati. So like Longobardo, their missionary positioning led them to detect among the people a tendency to practice rituals to obtain prosperity, health, wealth. Therefore, those missionaries consider the rituals as superstitious, while Longobardo attacked or criticized the rituals mainly as a pretense of religion in the hands of the literati. The controversy over the Chinese rites escalated through several well-known stages, resulting in their condemnation by the Vatican in 1704, 1715, and 1742. The condemnation of Chinese rites had a very negative effect on the development of Christianity in China, which was then treated as a pernicious sect, and there was restriction imposed in 1721 and a prohibition imposed in 1724. So we can see here, I mean, the picture I put, I think this painting, this drawing was made in Italy, and it was from the point of view of, I should say, the opponent to the Chinese rite. They depict in this drawing, they depict a kind of a sacrifice made to Confucius, and perhaps you may see that we see there are people who are kneeling down. The first row, you have the literati kneeling down, and you have the main officer kneeling down in front of. So it looks like a kind of pig, and because we had the idea that during the especially what we call the Confucius ritual, the Jiding, it was twice a year in the spring and autumn. There will be a ritual also to kill a pig and to offer a part of the animal. And so they depict the pig just at the center on the table. And so somehow they wanted to represent this as a kind of superstition because it is kind of imitation of the Eucharist. And so they want to depict that as a superstition, as idolatry, instead of worshipping the true God, and is worshipping idols. And so we see also on the sides, we have people doing a prosternation, and we have also at the corner, we have 4 small drawings, and those 4 drawings is to explain that the next day before the main offering to Confucius, in fact, there is a killing of the pig. And so there are some procedures, how to select the pig, all of that. And at the end, also according to the rituals in the Ming dynasty, in fact, you are going to bury the parts of the pig, the ear of the pig, and also the blood is going to be buried, all of that. And so all these depictions are made to express the idea that those rituals are superstitious, are idolatry, and not acceptable to Christian. So during this dispute, both camps invested considerable energy. They translated the classics and their various interpretations. They interviewed a Chinese Christian or not, up to the Emperor Kangxi. So if this controversy had any positive effect, it was in fact to allow a better understanding of the Chinese rites, of their practices, of the canonical and official text. However, the missionaries were asking a question that the Chinese had not asked themselves and had never discussed before, because those questions did not seem important to them. This is why the Chinese Rites Controversy remained essentially a foreign question, a question of foreigner, external to the Chinese tradition. So one of the most debated questions was the mode of presence of the spirit of Confucius and ancestor in the ritual. According to the Franciscan and Dominican, the Chinese believe that the spirit of Confucius and of the ancestor actually came unto the offerings. And by consuming the offerings, people could obtain prosperity, health, and wealth for themselves. So the Chinese rites were therefore of religious nature and therefore superstitious. But the Jesuit responded that the rite and the text should not be understood literally, but symbolically. Therefore, the rites are not religious, but only political or civil. And so that is a kind of a new terms, your new definition. Matteo Ricci did not use those terms of ritual as political or civil, but it was shaped by the Jesuit to show that they are not religious. So according to Confucius, by offering sacrifices, one served the deceased family members as if they were present. This means that one continued to serve the parents now in the same way they were served when alive. So when parents are alive, you serve them food, and they have left, but you continue to serve them food. But were the deceased really present during the rituals? So due to the conciseness of the Chinese language, there are many different interpretations. And the missionaries disagree on two of them. So the first interpretation, it is believed that the deceased are still alive, and even if they are not physically present, their spirits come during the ritual and approve the offerings brought to them, which the family consume to receive their blessing. So that is the first the interpretation developed by the Dominican and the Franciscan. And the second, by the Jesuit, it is believed that the deceased are still alive, and it is known that they are not present during the ritual. They are not present, but the ritual must be performed to express filial piety. So this second interpretation developed by the Jesuit makes ancestor rituals something non-religious and therefore acceptable to the Chinese Christian. So on both sides, the missionary failed to realize that they were reasoning in categories completely foreign to the Chinese folk. And those category of material versus spiritual, category of civil versus religious, the categories of real versus symbolic. And the missionary wanted to force an answer in one direction or the other. But it was somehow a question that was not addressed in that way in the Chinese tradition. So now I would like to come to my conclusion. So only in 1939, only in 1939 did Pope Pius XII authorized Chinese rite. But the motivation at that time was essentially political, to promote a better integration of the church within the Chinese state. With Vatican II, the relationship between faith and culture has been strongly emphasized, and Ricci has become a model of inculturation, which could allow integrating elements of Chinese rites into the liturgical practice of the church. And moreover, interreligious dialogue has become central, and the Christianity can recognize better the religiosity of the Chinese rite. So the approach of Ricci, I should say, is an approach of missiology, missiological approach, and he was correct in affirming the cultural, social, political importance of the Chinese rite, so that Christianity needed to allow those rites. But at the time of Ricci, he did not have the proper theology to integrate the Chinese rites into the Christian faith. So for Ricci, the Chinese rite remained only a kind of morality. It is only you perform this as a social, political, cultural obligation, as a good manners. But it did not go into a theological interpretation of the Chinese rites because it did not have the theological tools to do that. Paradoxically, the Franciscan and Dominican were correct. The Chinese rites express something which is fundamentally religious. But unlike them, unlike the Dominican or Franciscan at that time, we today, we can embrace the religiosity of the Chinese rites and even integrate them within sacramental theology as signs of God's presence and blessings. And so I think here we have a shift in our understanding of the sacraments. At the time of Ricci, the sacraments are mostly understood as something which is strictly from a kind of ecclesiastical approach, because the sacraments are mostly instituted by Christ. And so there is something which is institution, divine institution. But today, our understanding of the sacrament, I think, is much broader because of this kind of anthropological approach. We see today more the sacraments as expression of what is the deepest in our human aspiration, and what God comes into that. So I should say also that the church has a change since Ricci, but also China has a change. The fourth categories of the missionaries in the 16th and 17th century were foreign to the Chinese at that time. But today, of course, with the strong penetration of the Western ideas in modern China, in fact, Chinese people today are more also familiar with those ideas of religious, secular, material, spiritual, real, symbolic. And so contemporary Confucianism today recognizes the religious dimension of the Confucian tradition. And so there's been a debate, and there's been a kind of a progression of understanding at the time in the 1920s, a kind of rejection of the concept of religion by the Confucian, but later with Mo Zhongshan, and we see that they start to embrace the idea of religiosity, and not of religion as such, but of religiosity. And so we can situate better the Confucian tradition also today within this context of religiosity. I think also what is important is today that the Confucianism is not completely understood as a kind of isolated, as a single school, but now we understand the better Confucianism as completely integrated with Buddhism, Taoism, popular religion. And so it is not perhaps we go beyond this kind of doctrinal definition of Confucianism that of course also the Jesuits contributed to create in some way. So the rites toward ancestor and the Confucius address the question of familial tradition, of cultural transmission between generations in our modern society. So in the modern age, with the rise of mobility and from countryside to the urban area, with the rise of the modern value, putting more stress on the individual who have this capacity somehow also to have mobile roots, and we are still enrooted into a tradition, but our roots need to be mobile. We need to circulate between geographical area, but also different tradition, culture. So the traditional rites of the ancestor today perhaps have take a new importance, a new meaning. And I believe they can be revived. So of course it is not to replicate what happened in the past, but today I think those rituals to the ancestor, they have their deep significance. In societies where individuals feel the need of expressing a spiritual bondage, spiritual connection, a social continuity between generations, those rituals can play a greater role. And I believe along other religions, along also civil and cultural groups, Christianity as a kind of a structure community can help to revitalize those traditional rites to the ancestor and Confucius in the modern society. Thank you.